In the spring of 1974, at a farm liquidation sale outside of Grundy Center, Iowa, a 31-year-old woman named Lorene Pfeiffer paid $11 for 4 grain sacks of open-pollinated corn seed that the auctioneer listed with something close to embarrassment. The sacks were canvas, not paper, which told you their age before you read the label. The label said Pfister's open-pollinated yellow dent, and the ink had faded to a color somewhere between brown and nothing. The sacks had been stored in a corn crib that had lost 2 boards on the south side, which meant they'd been through at least one winter with wind coming through, and the mice had gotten into the bottom of the 3rd sack, and the 4th sack had a seam that someone had resewn with baling twine, which was the kind of repair you made when you didn't have anything better, but you didn't want to throw the thing away either. The auctioneer said, and these are nearly his exact words, that he had 4 sacks of old seed corn that probably wasn't worth the canvas it was sewn in, and did anybody want to start at $5? A man from the grain elevator offered 3. Lorene offered 11. The elevator man looked at her the way you look at someone who has just done something you can't quite categorize, and he let her have it. The story traveled from that sale to the feed store on the east side of Grundy Center by Monday morning. By Tuesday, it had reached the co-op on Highway 14. By Wednesday, it was in the diner on G Avenue, and the version at the diner had already grown a detail that wasn't in the original, which was that Lorene Pfeiffer had paid $11 for seed corn that a mouse had been living in. That detail was close enough to true that nobody corrected it. By the following Sunday, it had made the church parking lot at First Lutheran, and the men standing by their trucks after the service agreed that Lorene Pfeiffer had always been a little different, and this was just the latest proof. Let me tell you about Lorene Pfeiffer, because what she did with those 4 canvas sacks only makes sense if you understand who she was and where she came from and what she had been taught to see when other people saw nothing. Lorene was born in 1943 on 160 acres in Grundy County that her grandfather had broken from prairie sod in 1901, and that her father, Werner Pfeiffer, had farmed without a mortgage for as long as anyone could remember. Werner was not a man who talked much about money except to say that a payment was a promise made to someone who did not share your risk, and he had no interest in making promises of that kind. He grew corn and soybeans on the flat ground and kept a kitchen garden that his wife, Alma, managed with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. Werner's other occupation, the one that mattered most to what Lorene would become, was seeds. Werner Pfeiffer had been saving seeds since before Lorene was born. He kept a notebook, a green ledger-style book with his name written on the cover in pencil, in which he recorded every variety he had ever grown, every year he had grown it. The germination rate he had measured by wrapping 10 seeds in a wet cloth and counting what sprouted, the yield per acre, the standability in a wind year, the days to maturity, the ear height, and the color and texture of the kernel at harvest. He had entries going back to 1928. He had varieties in that notebook that the seed catalogs had stopped listing before the Second World War. He had a strain of yellow dent corn that his own father had selected over 40 years, choosing the best ears from the best plants and drying them on a nail in the granary that yielded within 8 to 10 bushels per acre of the pioneer hybrids his neighbors were buying, and he had grown it on the same ground, so long that it had adapted to the specific drainage and the specific soil pH and the specific first frost date of that particular 160 acres, in a way that no catalog variety could replicate. He taught Lorene the notebook before he taught her to drive. He showed her how to select ears, not the biggest ears, not the prettiest ears, but the ears from the plants that stood the straightest in a wind, that silked earliest, that filled to the tip without missing kernels, that husked back cleanly and dried on the stalk without mold. He showed her how to test germination on the kitchen counter in February, how to calculate the seeding rate adjustment if germination came back at 80% instead of 95%, how to store seed in the granary at the right moisture to keep it viable through a second winter if you needed to. He told her that a farmer who bought his seed every year was a farmer who had handed the most important decision on his operation to someone he'd never met, and that a farmer who saved his own seed had kept that decision where it belonged. Werner Pfeiffer died in February of 1971 after a short illness, and he left Lorene the 160 acres, the Green Ledger notebook, a granary with 4 varieties of open-pollinated corn in labeled bins, 2 varieties of open-pollinated soybeans, and a savings account at the Grundy Center State Bank with a balance of $14,200. He left her no debt. He left her the notebook and the knowledge of how to use it. He left her, in other words, everything that mattered. Lorene was 27 when she took over the farm. She had been farming alongside her father for 6 years by then, and she knew the ground and the varieties and the records as well as he had. Her brother, Harold, who farmed 120 acres of his own 4 miles north, offered to help her plant that first spring. She thanked him and said she'd call if she needed anything. She didn't call. Now, the 4 sacks of Pfister's open-pollinated yellow dent. When Lorene looked at those canvas sacks sitting in the bed of her truck on the way home from the liquidation sale, she didn't see what everyone else saw. Everyone else saw old seed of uncertain age and questionable germination, bought from a corn crib, with a broken wall and a mouse problem. Lorene saw a variety she did not have in her granary, from a breeding line she had read about in her father's notebook, but never grown, with a maturity date 3 days earlier than her best current variety, which mattered on her ground because the northwest corner of her 160 acres was low and wet and sometimes didn't dry fast enough in October for a late-maturing hybrid to finish cleanly. She had been looking for an earlier variety for 3 years. She had written to 2 seed houses in 1972 and been told the open-pollinated lines she was asking about were no longer available. She had asked at the co-op and been told she should just buy a shorter season hybrid, which was not the same thing and she knew it. And then a farm 4 miles away had gone to liquidation, and the estate had included 4 sacks of exactly what she'd been trying to find, and she had paid $11 for them while a man from the grain elevator offered $3. That's why nobody understood the purchase. They were seeing an impulsive woman throwing money at mouse-chewed seed corn. They were watching a plant breeder completing a 3-year acquisition plan. Let me tell you about what Lorene did with those sacks, because this is where the story stops being about one purchase and starts being about something that Werner Pfeiffer would have recognized without needing it explained. She got home from the sale and spread the seed from all 4 sacks on the granary floor, under the single bulb she'd had Werner wire in the year before he died. She sorted through it by hand, kernel by kernel, for a full afternoon, pulling out anything that was discolored, anything that showed mold damage, anything that the mice had touched. What she had left was perhaps 60% of the original volume, which she put in a clean canvas sack she had sewn herself from feed sacking. She ran a germination test that same week, wrapped 100 seeds in wet cloth, kept them at 68 degrees on the shelf above the wood stove in the kitchen, counted what sprouted on day 5 and day 7 and day 10. 73 out of 100 germinated. That was low, but it was workable, and it was better than she had expected from seed that had wintered in a broken crib. She planted a test plot that spring, not her whole northwest corner, not yet. A 1/4-acre strip between her best-performing yellow dent and the fence line, so she could compare them side by side under identical conditions on identical soil, with identical rainfall, and see what she actually had. She marked the strip with a stake at each end, and she wrote the planting date and the germination rate and the seeding rate adjustment in the green ledger notebook in the same format her father had used since 1928. What she found at the end of that season was that the Pfister line matured 4 days earlier than her established variety, that it yielded 11 bushels per acre, less on the good ground, but only 3 bushels less on the wet northwest corner, where the earlier maturity gave it time to finish that the other variety didn't always have, and that it husked back with a cleaner, drier ear than anything she'd grown before. She wrote all of this in the notebook. She selected the best 40 ears from the best 40 plants in the test strip, dried them on nails in the granary through the winter, and shelled them in February for the next year's seed supply. She did this for 3 years before she planted the Pfister line on her northwest corner as her primary variety. By the time she committed to it, she had grown it on her specific ground under her specific conditions for 3 seasons, had selected from it 3 times for the traits that mattered on her farm, and had a germination rate in her saved seed of 91%, 18 points higher than the original purchase. She had spent $11 on the seed and perhaps 40 hours of her own labor over 3 years. The seed was now adapted to her farm in a way that could not be bought from any catalog. Her neighbors were spending between $18 and $24 per acre on certified hybrid seed corn every spring by the mid-1970s. Lorraine's seed cost was the labor of selection and the granary space, which she had anyway. She tracked this in the notebook under a column her father had started, and she had continued, labeled simply seed cost per acre. And she had been writing 0 in that column or close to it since 1971. Let me tell you about what happened over the next several years, because this is where the story stops being about seed corn and starts being about arithmetic. By 1976, Lorraine had expanded her saved seed program to include 3 varieties of open-pollinated corn, 2 varieties of soybeans, and her mother's pole bean seed, which was not a cash crop, but which Alma had saved for 30 years, and which Lorraine had no intention of letting go. She had begun trading seed with 2 other farmers in the county, a man named Clarence Siebert, who farmed near Wellsburg, and had a strain of oat that Lorraine wanted for a cover crop rotation, and an older woman named Vera de Twyler, who had been saving seed on her family's place since before Werner Pfeiffer had started his notebook. Lorraine and Vera traded seed every February and compared germination notes and talked about selection criteria with the focus and precision of people who understood that they were doing something the rest of the county had mostly stopped doing, and that this fact had implications they could both see clearly. The implications were these. The certified hybrid seed market had consolidated through the 1960s and into the 1970s in ways that reduced the number of suppliers and increased the price per bag, without a corresponding increase in yield on every soil type. The hybrids were bred for average conditions across large regions. Lorraine's ground was not average. It was specific. The northwest corner was specific. The soil pH on the east side of the property ran slightly higher than the west side and responded differently to the same variety. Her saved seed knew these things. A catalog variety did not. She was not opposed to hybrids on principle. She was opposed to paying for something she could produce herself at a fraction of the cost. And she was opposed to the dependency that came with buying seed every year from a supplier who could raise prices, discontinue varieties, or go out of business without any obligation to her operation. Her father had said this to her when she was 12 years old, and she had written it in the front of the Green Ledger notebook in her own handwriting. A seed you save is a seed you own. A seed you buy is a seed you're borrowing until next year. If you have ever watched a community treat someone's most careful preparation as a punchline, and then watch that same community fall silent when the preparation turned out to be the only thing that worked, stick with me, because that is exactly what happened. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next story I'm telling. By 1978, Lorraine had $312 in seed costs recorded in the notebook for the entire decade since she'd taken over the farm. Her neighbors were spending that much in a single season on a single field. She had been putting the difference into the savings account at Grundy Center State Bank every fall, not all of it, because she reinvested in equipment maintenance and soil testing and lime, but a significant portion of it, and the account had grown from the $14,200 her father had left her to just over $31,000 by the end of 1978. She had done this while farming the same 160 acres with no additional income, in years when corn prices had been volatile enough to make her brother Harold consider renting out his ground and taking a job at the implement dealer in town. She had not considered this. She had considered her costs, which were low, and her yields, which were consistent if not spectacular, and the notebook, which told her the truth about her operation. And she had concluded that she was fine. The spring of 1979 was when the first external confirmation arrived, and it came from a direction that surprised people who had been laughing at Lorraine Pfeiffer's seed habit for 5 years. A man named Dale Frobish, who farmed 320 acres on the east side of the county and had been buying Pioneer seed corn since 1965, stopped at Lorraine's farm on a Tuesday in late April. He had heard through the specific channel that information traveled in Grundy County, which was from the co-op to the feed store, to the neighbor who lived a quarter-mile from Lorraine's driveway, that her corn had stood better than the surrounding fields in the wet fall of 1978. Not just better, noticeably better. The northwest corner that everyone had written off as marginal ground had put up a stand that harvested cleaner and drier than the certified hybrid on the adjacent field, which belonged to a man named Roy Kiefer, and which had gone down in a late October wind that came through with enough force to lodge about 30% of his Pioneer stand before the picker could get to it. Dale Frobish pulled into Lorraine's driveway and got out of his truck and looked at the granary for a moment before he knocked on the door. She came out, and he told her what he'd heard and asked if he could look at her seed corn. She took him to the granary and showed him the bins, the labeled varieties, the germination test results pinned to the wall above each bin on index cards in her handwriting. He stood there for a while with his cap in his hand, reading the index cards, and then he asked her how much she would sell him for 200 acres. She told him she didn't sell seed. She told him she traded seed, and that if he had something she needed, she would consider a trade, and that if he wanted to learn to save his own, she would show him how, but that she wasn't in the seed business and didn't intend to be. He stood there a little longer. He rubbed the back of his neck. He said he'd heard her father had been doing this for 40 years. She said longer than that. He put his cap back on and looked at the nearest bin and said he guessed, he understood, and he drove home. He called Vera Detweiler that evening, which Lorene learned about the following week, the story that spread through the county after Dale Frobish's visit was different from the story that had spread after the liquidation sale. The first story had been about a woman who paid $11 for mouse-chewed seed corn. The second story was about a woman whose corn had stood when Roy Kiefer's didn't, and who had turned down Dale Frobish's money, and who had a granary full of seed that nobody else in the county had, and that she had no intention of selling. Farmers tell different stories than they used to tell when they've seen something with their own eyes. Let me tell you about what happened in the early 1980s, because this is where the story stops being about Lorene Pfeiffer's farm and starts being about every farm in Grundy County. You know what happened in the 1980s. If you grew up in a farming county, or if you know anyone who did, you know. Interest rates climbed to 18%. Land values that had doubled through the 1970s dropped by 40% in 3 years. Corn fell below $2 a bushel in 1985. The farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values to buy more ground, who had taken equipment loans at the new rates, who had been running their operations on the assumption that land would keep appreciating and commodity prices would stay strong, found themselves in a position that had no good exits. The banks called notes. The county had a farm liquidation auction almost every month through 1983 and 1984. Lorene watched the auction notices in the newspaper the way her father had watched the weather, quietly and with complete attention. Roy Kiefer lost his ground in the spring of 1983. He had borrowed against his land in 1978 to buy a new combine and had refinanced at a rate that looked manageable when corn was at $3 and looked like a trap when corn dropped to $1.80. The bank gave him 2 years, and then it didn't give him any more time. Dale Frobish held on longer because he had less debt, but he sold his East Quarter in 1984 to make a payment and farmed the remaining ground on margins so thin that he told his wife he couldn't afford to get sick. Lorene's expenses didn't change. They couldn't change. There was nothing to cut. She had no seed costs to speak of. She had no equipment loans. She had no mortgage. Her input costs were soil amendments, fuel, and the labor of her own hands, and none of those had a creditor attached to them. She watched what was happening in the county with a quiet sadness that was not satisfaction. These were her neighbors. Roy Kiefer had been a decent farmer. Dale Frobish had worked hard his entire life. They had not been careless people. They had built their operations on borrowed money because that was what the system encouraged, and what the dealers and the bankers and the extension office had told them was the path to growth. And when the system turned against them, they had no margin to absorb the change. Lorene had margin. She had been building margin since 1971, one low-cost seed season at a time, one zero in the seed cost column at a time, and the margin had accumulated into something the bank could not touch because the bank had no claim on it. By 1984, the savings account at Grundy Center State Bank had a balance of $62,400. In October of 1984, Roy Kiefer's ground went to auction. 80 acres adjacent to Loreen's east fence line, good flat ground with a tile system her father had helped lay in 1958. Ground that Loreen had looked at across the fence for her entire life. The opening bid was $400 an acre. A land speculator from Des Moines opened at $450. A second speculator went to $500. Loreen bid $550. The speculator from Des Moines looked at her. He went to $600. She went to $650. He paused for longer than auctioneers like, and then he shook his head and stepped back, because he was working with borrowed money and she was not. And there is a ceiling to what borrowed money will do at an auction, when the person bidding against you has no ceiling at all. Loreen Pfeiffer paid $52,000 for 80 acres of Grundy County farmland in October of 1984. She paid with a cashier's check drawn on the savings account at Grundy Center State Bank. The auctioneer read the amount, and the crowd, which included Dale Frobish and 3 men from the co-op board, and the loan officer from the bank who had been trying to sell the ground on Roy Kiefer's behalf, went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when they are rearranging everything. They thought they knew about a person they had been quietly dismissing for 10 years. Dale Frobish found her after the auction, near the parking area. He stood next to her truck for a moment without saying anything. Then he said he supposed he understood now what she'd been doing. She looked at him for a moment and said she'd been doing what her father taught her. He nodded and looked at the ground. He said Werner Pfeiffer had been a smart man. She said he had been. They stood there a moment longer, and then she got in her truck and drove home. Let me tell you about what happened after that, because the land purchase was not the end of the story. It was the proof that the story had been true all along. Loreen farmed the expanded 240 acres through the late 1980s and into the 1990s. She added the Kiefer ground to her rotation and extended her seed selection program to include varieties suited to the slightly different drainage pattern on the east side. The Green Ledger notebook her father had started in 1928 filled up entirely in 1987, and she started a second notebook in the same format, same columns, same handwriting. She bought a second notebook that was identical to the first one and kept them both on the shelf in the granary above the germination test results. The 1988 drought hit Grundy County hard. Loreen's yields dropped, as everyone's did, but her open-pollinated varieties had deeper root systems than the shallow-rooted hybrids, bred for high-input, irrigated conditions, and her corn found moisture at depths that the certified hybrids on the surrounding ground could not reach. She did not have a good year in 1988. She had a survivable year, which was better than several of her neighbors managed. She also had, by 1988, a seed supply that was entirely her own. 14 years of continuous selection on her specific ground had produced varieties that were adapted to her farm at a level of specificity that no commercial breeder could replicate for a single farm in Grundy County, Iowa. She had varieties in her granary that existed nowhere else in the world. She understood this and treated it with the seriousness it deserved. In 1991, a seed company that had been supplying certified hybrid corn to about a third of the farms in the eastern part of the county went out of business in February, 6 weeks before planting season. The company had been bought by a larger corporation in 1988, and the parent company had discontinued the regional subsidiary as part of a consolidation that made sense on a spreadsheet in an office building somewhere, and made no sense at all to the farmers in Grundy County who had ordered their seed in November and were now being told in February that their order would not be filled. There was a scramble. Dealers sold out within a week. The co-op brought in seed from 2 states away at a premium price. Some farmers planted late because they couldn't get seed on time, and late planting in Iowa costs yield, and everyone in the county knew it. The feed store on the east side of Grundy Center had men standing in it every morning, that February and March, talking about the situation with the focused anxiety of people who have just discovered that a dependency they didn't know they had has been called in all at once. Lorene Pfeiffer had plenty of seed. She had planned her seed supply in November, as she always did, had run her germination tests in January, as she always did, had her planting rate calculations in the notebook, as she always did, and she was ready to plant on the first suitable day in late April, as she always was. She did not go to the feed store that February and March. She did not need to. Word reached her through Vera Detweiler, who was still trading seed with her every winter, that 3 farmers in the county were asking whether Lorene might have seed to spare. She thought about it for a week. Then she called all 3 of them and told them she would give them seed, not sell it, on one condition: that they come to her granary and she would show them how to select and save their own, and that they would save seed from whatever she gave them and return to her the following February with a germination report and a selection account of what they had done. 2 of them agreed. The 3rd said he'd rather just buy the seed. She told him she understood and gave him the name of a dealer 2 counties over who might still have inventory. She spent 2 Saturdays in March teaching the 2 farmers who had agreed to her terms. She showed them the notebook. She showed them the index cards above the bins. She showed them the germination test set up on the shelf above the wood stove, which had been in the same position since her father had built it in the 1950s. She walked them through selection criteria, the way Werner had walked her through them when she was young, not as a lecture, but as a conversation about what you were looking for and why, about what the plant was telling you if you knew how to read it. One of those 2 farmers, a man named Gerald Meyer, who farmed 110 acres south of Wellsburg, saved seed continuously from that year forward. He came back the following February with a germination report of 88% and a selection notebook he had started in a composition book from the drugstore. Lorene looked at the notebook and said it was a good start and that he should keep going. He kept going for the next 20 years. By the time Lorene was in her mid-50s, her niece, a girl named Carla, who was Werner's granddaughter through Harold's side of the family, had started spending summers on the farm. Carla was 14. The first summer she ran the germination tests herself, following the index cards on the wall and the instructions in the green ledger notebook. And Lorene stood in the doorway of the granary and watched her work without saying anything because the work was being done correctly and there was nothing to add. Carla asked her once on an evening in late August when they were shelling seed corn on the granary floor, what Lorene thought about the fact that most of the county had gone back to buying certified seed after the 1991 shortage had resolved, and the new suppliers had come in with competitive prices. Lorene shelled corn for a moment without answering. Then she said that most people made the decision that was easiest to make in a good year, and that the decision that mattered was the one that held up in a bad year, and that she had seen enough bad years to know the difference. Carla wrote that down in her own notebook that evening. She had started keeping notes the same way Lorene kept notes, same columns, same format, because that was what she had been shown, and it was the right way to do it. The green ledger notebook Werner Pfeiffer had started in 1928 was still on the shelf in the granary. The second notebook Lorene had started in 1987 was next to it. Carla's composition book was next to that. 3 notebooks spanning 7 decades of continuous seed saving on the same ground, in the same county, by the same family, each one in a different handwriting, and all of them recording the same information in the same format because the format was correct, and there was no reason to change what was correct. Let me ask you something. What do you see when you look at 4 canvas sacks of old seed corn with faded labels and a resewn seam, sitting in a corn crib with a broken wall in Grundy County, Iowa, in the spring of 1974? Most people saw $11 thrown at something a mouse had already decided wasn't worth keeping. Lorene Pfeiffer saw a variety she had been looking for 3 years, on ground she understood better than any catalog could, in a lineage that her father had respected, and that the seed industry had decided was no longer profitable to maintain. She saw the last copy of something that was about to disappear, and she understood that disappearance and dependency were the same problem wearing different clothes. She paid $11. She spent 40 years selecting, recording, teaching, and refusing to hand the most important decision on her operation to someone who didn't share her risk. She bought 80 acres of her neighbor's ground with cash, while 2 speculators from Des Moines decided their borrowed money had a ceiling. She filled 3 notebooks with the truth about her farm, and she handed those notebooks to her niece on a shelf in a granary that her grandfather had built in 1911, and that was still standing because Werner Pfeiffer had overbuilt everything he touched. The seed company folded in February. Lorene had plenty. That is the difference between someone who buys and someone who saves. One of them is ready for February. The other one is standing in the feed store hoping someone 2 states away has inventory